Why do we do what we do? Well, in my case, I'm 64 years old. I'm retired from full-time preaching and teaching, but I still do a little bit of both. And I really retired with the idea that I would begin to start doing some of these YouTube videos and concentrating on some articles I had been writing for a website for over 10 years so that I could maybe have a little bit more of a broader influence. Not because I think that I have such an important message, but because I've studied the Bible and I realize that the Bible is an important message. Though it's not mine, it's something that I can pass along. And so that's what I'm attempting to do right now. But it's also at this stage of my life that gives a great deal of the motivation for why I do what I do. My wife and I, Carolyn, have 7 grandchildren with another one on the way. And they're wonderful grandchildren most of the time. I've got a 6-year-old grandson and a 7-year-old granddaughter, both about to have birthdays, but they came up to me not too long ago. They'd been staying with us here in Happy, and their parents had come back to pick them up, and before they got in their vehicle, they came running back to the house, giggling, and one of them looked at me and said, "Pops, you look like a girl." And then the other one said, "An ugly girl." Well, there are days where I would probably sell them to the highest bidder, but for the most part, I love my grandchildren with all my heart, and there's not anything that I wouldn't do for them. I suppose that there's not a single one of them that I wouldn't lay my life down for if it came to that. Hope it never does. But that's how fiercely devoted I am to them. I mentioned we've got 7 right now, and 8th on the way. It's due July the 4th, and so it's going to be a firecracker of a baby, just like our other 7 grandchildren. And if it's anything like the other 7, it'll be a dandy. This is what motivates Carolyn and I in the different things that we do right now. It's because, in large part, we want to leave behind a better world for our grandchildren. We grew up with a lot of benefits because of the era that we grew up in. My parents and Carolyn's parents, our grandparents, raised our parents during the Depression and the World War II era, and it was a very challenging time, to say the least. There were a lot of struggles, and yet, even with all those struggles, our grandparents raised our parents to be godly. They instilled within each one of them Christian principles. And then our parents, in turn, did the very best that they could with that. Both Carolyn and I, as mothers, were of the stay-at-home generation, which we really appreciated. Don't get me wrong, they worked just as hard as our fathers did, but they stayed at home and they raised the kids, as did so many in that generation. Economic times were different, and they were able to do a lot more with one income. It still, it many times was very much of a shoestring income at that, but they never even thought about going and getting a job outside of the house and then allowing somebody else to raise their children. Because of the era that we grew up in, we had tremendous advantages that I don't believe this current generation has. For one thing, things were a lot more simple back then. There were not many electronics that were available to kids. Television was black and white when we were first getting familiar with television when we were growing up, and there wasn't much on. And so we spent a lot of time outdoor playing, and that's the way our moms preferred it when it came to that. And because we didn't have so many distractions, we got involved with other people. It was very important to learn how to get along with different people because you were going to be with them most of the time. There was not a lot of going to your room and playing some video game. There weren't video games at that time, but it was just a different era. But one of the things our parents did for us was they became even more concentrated on our spiritual lives than their parents were upon theirs because they had a little bit more time for that. And so we had bedtime Bible stories growing up. We had prayers at every meal, and we had our meals together as a family. Obviously, Dad was gone during the daytime, but we typically had breakfast together, and then we would have dinner as a family again, and we'd sit down at the table and we'd visit about different things. We had a prayer of thanksgiving before each meal. And then when it came to the worship, Sundays were reserved for God. Now we could play in between worship services, but we went to Sunday school every Sunday and to worship every Sunday morning and to worship again every Sunday evening. That was the focal point. And then we even had Bible class at midweek or prayer meeting. None of these things were for discussion. My parents never permitted any of we kids, nor did Carolyn's parents permit any of their kids to decide whether or not they would be going to the worship or to Bible class. That was just a given. That was something that we did. And because we didn't wonder whether we were going or not, it was a part of our life, and an important part of our life at that. Well, when we had our turn, Carolyn and I, and we started having children, we tried to duplicate much of that as best we could. Carolyn was very content to be a stay-at-home mother, and while that certainly created certain financial obstacles along the way, they were financial obstacles that we were glad to have. We far preferred that to her working outside of the home and then letting somebody else raise our children. And so because she was content with that, and because she was more than willing to make ends meet with the budget that we had, and even do what she could to make a little bit of extra money with various projects that she had going, we were able to raise our children in the same way. And again, God became more and more a focal point of our family. And then as our kids got away from the house and they began to take spouses of their own and have families of their own, they have replicated this as well, much better than we did, I believe. And now they're raising our grandchildren to love and to respect God and to have an understanding that they're servants of God. And so as I look at all this, and I look at the time of life that I'm at right now, I feel a greater obligation to maybe make sure the world is in as good of a state as I possibly can influence it towards. And so I write these articles and I have these YouTubes and do that, but I have to admit that the motivation in large part is for my family, for my grandkids. And I want other families to have what we had. This world is not the same as the one that I grew up in. Well, physically, I realize it is, but spiritually, it's not. When I was growing up, you couldn't find a person who would admit to being an atheist. And nowadays, it seems to be very popular, very in, very sophisticated to act like you don't know if there's a God or not, or believe that there's not. We've changed a lot in that. We're a more sinful society. Things that would not have been permitted on television when I was growing up are the standard during prime time. Things that would have been considered profanity and pornography when I was younger are now considered rights of free speech. And so they permeate the airwaves and the computers and whatever devices we have with sinful activity. And the world's just getting to be a harder place, a less loving place. And I'm convinced something needs to be done about that. It was my generation, in large part, that allowed this to happen. And so I feel like it's my generation that's very responsible for trying to restore some of the righteousness that we have lost, that we permitted to be lost. These are the types of things that that motivate me. There's a couple of passages that really stand out in this when I think about our influence on others, and especially children. In Matthew 18, verse 6, Jesus said this, "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the sea." You see, if we don't do something about this wicked society, if we contribute to the things that are causing these little ones who believe in Christ to sin, well, Jesus just says it'd be better if we had a millstone tied around our neck and were drowned. It's that serious, and he wants us to understand that. But he also wants us to understand how great the reward is for just doing a little bit, for just trying to do our part to rescue these kids. And also in Matthew, he said this, "If anyone gives one of these little ones even a cup of cold water because he's my disciple, truly I say to you, he will not lose his reward." And so we're presented with this choice. We can either permit society to run downhill, to become more and more promiscuous, to become more and more sinful, and just to accept that as the way that life is, or we can try and change things for the better. Not because we're perfect, but in fact because we're imperfect. We realize that we have our own failings, but because all decent people who realize that they have failings are going to want to correct those failings as best they can, and then help others to get to the point where they won't have to make the same mistakes that they did. My generation made a lot of mistakes. We're suffering. The entire world is suffering because of that right now, and especially the little ones. They do not have the type of world to grow up in that we were given, that we were gifted, not only by God, but by our parents and grandparents doing their part. And so, when you wonder why you do what you do, think about what motivates you. Think about what's most important to you in your life. And then think about, if it really is the most important, are your actions agreeing with what you think is important? Are you trying to help other people? Are you trying to bring the good news of Jesus Christ to a world that's lost? Are you trying to influence your own family and future generations of your own family to be servants of God and servants of Christ? It's not hypocritical for you to do that if you have failed in the past. What would be hypocritical would be for you to realize that you had sinned, but that you're going to do nothing about that. You're just going to keep on sinning as if God will accept that. He will not. And not only will he not accept that sin, but that sin has consequences, and it will affect your children, and it will affect your grandchildren. The way you act is going to affect everyone around you. And so make sure that the things that you do agree with the things that you think and that you hold dear. And if you and I can do our very best to serve God to the best of our ability, to encourage others to do that, and to enjoy the good things that he's given to us in life, I believe we're going to be able to leave behind a better world. I'm going to tell you, my children are worth that. My grandchildren are worth that. And so too are yours. So let's do something about it. Have we failed in the past? You bet. But let's not just wallow in the consequences of our past sins. Let's leave that behind. And let's then do our best to build a world that's worth leaving to the future generations. Why do you do what you do? Something we all need to think about, isn't it? Well, I appreciate your tuning in today. I know you've got a busy schedule, so thank you for taking this time. I hope we'll see you again next time. But until then, God bless.